Jeff Scott at Blackhawk Technical College. I'm going to right now go over the last chapter for Professional MVC. Give you the right title. Professional ASP.NET MVC5. I've done the first three chapters of the book, and now I'm going to go over chapter 4, Models, which is the last chapter I will be going over. You can see our objectives: how to model a music store, what it means to scaffold, how to edit an album, and all about model binding. This is actually going to be a very fast lecture just because of the fact this is really heady stuff. I'm not even sure if anybody's watching this. So I went out to the Rock site for the book, grabbed all of the code, and clicked entire book's download at 82 meg, and that should be right here. So what I'm going to do right before your very eyes, ASP.NET MVC5 source code, paste that in there. Must have something else open on the other thing. Well, I had sound coming out of there, I don't know why. Alright, so there's that, there's the folder. Copy. In fact, let's cut it right away. And I'm going to paste that right out to the P drive. Yesterday I didn't have a P drive from the virtual desktop, which was interesting. 152, 161. Paste. And there's the source code. Alright. Let's extract that. And there's a reason that I'm extracting that, and that is that they have the project in here for chapter 4. They've got it for every chapter, I believe. Alright, so I want chapter 4. Well, not every chapter, it looks like. So let's copy that. Let's paste that right here, and then let's extract it. Okay. And then let's bring that up. Actually got 2 copies of this running, so I'll have to drop one. I don't need the other one. Should be okay now. So this chapter is about 30 pages long. I'm not even sure if anybody's watching this. No one has commented to me one way or the other, which is the other reason for not spending a whole heck of a lot of time on it. Okay, so jumping back. We already went over the objectives, and I've given you the download, which again contains a completed project for the chapter. In the last chapter we learned about models. In the previous chapter we learned about controllers. I'm sorry, in the last chapter we learned about models in detail. Let's try that again. In this chapter we learned about models in detail. So pretty much we've finished the then. In chapter 2 we talked about, chapter 1 was just an overview. Chapter 2 was on controllers. Chapter 3 was on views, and now chapter 4 is on models. As they say, the word model means different things in the software community. There's all sorts of different kinds of models. It says even when one scopes the term model in the context of MVC design pattern, you can still have a debate over what it's about. This chapter talks about models as the objects you use to send information to a database, more than anything else. Also, as it says, to perform business calculation, render a view, etc. As it mentions, models represent the domain that an application focuses on. And the models are the objects you want to display, save, create, update, and delete. Alright? Again, I'm going to just kind of whip through this fairly quickly here. It is now 6:41, and I hope to be done no later than 7:15. ASP, as mentioned on the top of page 76, provides a bunch of different models and a bunch of different ways that you can do things. The author says, let's work through an example. In this section, you'll continue with the ASP.NET MVC music store scenario and bring about what you've learned so far about controllers, views, and adding models in the third ingredient. Well, I've already got the completed project. Alright, so when they tell you to do all this stuff, again, I'm not going to do it. Rather, I've got the project right here. So what I'll do is just bring up the stuff that they talk about. It'll make it a little faster. And like I said, with considering the fact that I'm not sure if anybody's even watching these tapes, if you are, drop me an email sometime and let me know. It'd be nice to know that I've done them for some reason. Okay. So start with File, New Project. We know how to do that. After you give it a name, Visual Studio opens it up. All right, you can tell Visual Studio you want to work with the MVC template. We've already talked about that. As it says, it gives you everything that you need to get started. The layout view, the default homepage, etc. Two files are in your model folders. In your models folder, account view models and identity models. Both these files, as it says, are associated with user account management. They talk about them in chapter 7. You've got the whole book, and now you've got all the code. So if you want to look at that, you'll be able to. The models folder is almost empty because the project template doesn't know the domain you're working on or the problem you're trying to solve at the current time. Eventually, as mentioned, you might decide the first step is having the ability to list, create, edit, and delete music information. In other words, do the equivalent of CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete operations that you'd put on a database. All right. To add a new album to the album class to the models folder, right-click on the models folder. So we'd right-click right here. We'd choose Add Class, and we'd name the class. Here they tell you to name it Album. Leave the existing using and namespace statements as they are, and add the new one. And when we do, after we add album, they want you to come in and add this stuff. So you can see what we have in here is we've got a bunch of getters and setters here on page 78. So we're starting. Remember that models basically are code. All right, they're code that represent classes that, for lack of better words, quite often are just mocking what we have inside of a database. So you can notice here we'll probably end up having some kind of a database with some kind of a table, and that table will be named album. Probably our primary key will be album ID. We'll also have a genre ID and an artist ID. My guess is probably so that we're able to link these to a genre table and an artist table. We'll have a string with a title of the album, a decimal with the price of the album, a string with the album art URL, so like the cover photo or whatever, the actual genre that it's in, and the artist who sings it. As mentioned, the class will not yet compile because we haven't created or defined the genre and artist classes. It says that's okay, we're going to do that soon. Now, notice this, because I just want to bring out a few things, especially considering the fact that unless you decide that you want to do some kind of an ASP.NET project for your 152, 164 Design and Implementation Projects class, this might be the last time you ever look at any of this stuff. So as mentioned, Visual Studio has a useful snippet for creating auto-implemented projects, getters and setters. It says to quickly create them, type prop, hit tab, all right, to expand the snippet, and the default value is int. All right, so you need to change it. So in other words, when you come in here, let's go into models. I'm not going to end up saving this anyway, so I'm just going to come over here to album CS. And you can see the stuff that was created. But if I were to hit enter and type in prop, tab, notice what it puts in there for me. Okay? So for instance, if I wanted to put artist, I'd have to change the type, I'd have to change the name, etc. But it's got some stuff that it's already provided for you. I mean, is that something you normally have to use? Well, of course not. But it's something that you might decide to use. It's a little nicety, a freebie, whatever you want to call it, that's provided for you from visualstudio.net. All right, turning up to page 79. To add a new artist class, we're going to do the same kind of thing. So you right mouse click on the models folder, you choose add new class, and there it is. Notice it's a very simple class. It's got an ID, and again that ID is the same one that we're going to be using in here as a foreign key, and it's got a virtual string with the artist name. Okay? It says you'll notice how each album has two properties for managing the associated artist. We call the artist property a navigational property because given an album, we can navigate to the album's associated artist using the dot operator. You'll see that a little bit later. The other one, the artist ID property, is a foreign key property. All right, it says because you know a bit about databases and you know artists and albums will maintain, in other words, we want to be able to hook those two tables together. All right, and we'll have what? a one-to-many relationship, because any one artist can have one or more albums. That should make sense to everybody. Ideally, she or he will. All right, you want to have a foreign key value for the artist embedded in the model in your album, which I just showed you, because the foreign key will exist between a table of artist records and the table of album records. Okay? All right. You can read your own stuff in here on the model relationship. Some people don't like it. You know what? It's been around forever. It's probably not going to go away soon. Albums also have an associated genre. As it says here, every genre can maintain a list of associated albums. So you see what we have in here on the bottom of page 79 in your book. After you create all these three classes, it says it's important that you quickly you build them. All right, so you combine the information that's in there, and the author says that it's very important. That's why it's making noise. I was reading about Green Bay's win last night. All right, and they're saying it's important that you build these for two reasons. First, it serves as a quick check to make sure you don't have any syntax errors, and the newly added classes won't show up in Visual Studio Scaffolding that we'll talk about in just a minute until you've compiled the application. So compiling, it says, is not just a good practice. It's required for any new or changed models to show up in scaffolding dialogues. What scaffolding will do, and I'm going to mention it to you in a really generic way. I've done very little with it, but I do have, I think, at least a basic understanding of what it does. All right? And that is, it'll create some code for you. And it kind of does the quasi-database work for you. All right? They mention here, in the adding a view section in chapter 3, you saw that add a view allows you to select the template. The code generation is known. The template then creates the full view code for you. The code generation is known as scaffolding, and you can use it for more than just views. Scaffolding is mentioned here in ASP.NET. MVC can generate boilerplate code for CRUD functionality. All right? So it examines the type, and it generates the controller. So it looks at what you're working with. So it would look at this album, this genre, and this artist class, and it'll basically create for you the associated create code to put records into the database, update, delete, and select type of code. All right, so it does a lot. It says it knows how to name controllers, how to name views, the code that goes into each component, but as mentioned on the bottom here of page 80, it doesn't build the entire application. All right, rather it takes a lot of the mundane stuff that people do, and some people look forward to that stuff, to be honest with you, but it relieves the developer of having to do some of that stuff. Page 81 here, if you don't like the default scaffold behavior, you can customize it or replace it or just not use it. You can remove it and create your own. A variety of scaffolding templates exist in MVC5. You can have an empty one, so the only action it has in there is an index action with no code inside, other than to return the default view result, so it doesn't create any views. You can have a controller with read-write actions. As it says, it adds a controller to your project with index details, create, edit, and delete. So it's got, basically, it's got the CRUD capabilities for you. Notice it says they're not entirely empty, but they won't perform any work until you add your own code and create your own views for the section. All right, there's API controller scaffolders that they talk about in chapter 11. Again, you have the book, you have all the code. There's a controller with views using the entity framework. This may be the most important one. It says this template is the template you'll use to scaffold the store controller. It not only generates the controller, but it also generates all the required views and the code to persist and retrieve information from a database. For the template to generate the proper code, you have to select a model class, album in this case. It examines all the properties of your model and uses the information to build controllers, views, and data access mode. It also needs, as it says there, the name of a data context object here on page 82. It says you can point the scaffolding to an existing data context object, or you can have it create one for you. What is it? As it says, they need to take a short aside and talk about the entity framework, also known as the EF. This is a very complex topic. This is eventually what I'd hoped if we had another ASP.NET class, we would concentrate a lot on model view controller and the entity framework. All right. It says a new ASP.NET MVC5 project automatically includes a reference to the entity framework. It's an object relational or ORM mapping framework. and it understands how to store .NET objects for you in a relational database. So it relieves you of having to do some of the database work. It will do some of it for you. All right, notice, if you don't want to use it, all right, nothing forces you to do so. You're welcome to use anything you want. In fact, it says nothing in the framework forces you to use any kind of a database. You can build it in any way you want. In this chapter, you work with the entity framework, but many of the topics covered apply to a lot of different things. So notice, this is one of the things that they mentioned in here, starting on the bottom part of page 82. EF supports database first, model first, and code first styles of development. All right. The MVC scaffold uses code first style, which means, as you can see right there, you start storing and retrieving information without creating the database. Rather, you just write plain classes, and the entity framework figures out how and where to store those classes. All right. It says, remember how all the properties in your model objects are virtual? And if we went back and looked, that's what you see. Virtual properties are not required, but as it says, they give the entity framework a hook into C# classes and enable features like tracking to take place. All right. Which comes first, the code or the database? It says if you're already familiar with the EF and you have the model first or the database first, scaffolding will support that also, so you can do it either way. All right, a couple code first conventions here on page 83. It says the entity framework follows a number of conventions to make your life easier. If you want to read more, I'd suggest you go out to the Data Development Center at msdn.microsoft.com, the Microsoft Development Network, and go to right here. Okay? All right. The author mentions here, starting on the bottom of page 83, and this is where it breaks down as far as it gets really heavy here. All right, so you've been warned. It says when you're using the EF's code-first approach, the gateway to the database is a class derived from the entity framework's DB context class. The derived class has one or more properties of type DB set, and then T in brackets, angle brackets, where each T represents the type of object. So as you can see, we've got one of each one of these for each one of the tables that we're going to have, or be representing or modeling albums, artists, and genres. As it says, you can think of DB set, angle bracket, T, angle bracket, as a special data-aware generic list that knows how to load and save data from its parent. All right, so there it is. It says, using the preceding data context, you can retrieve all albums in alphabetic order using what's called a link query. Link is line item query, and what link allows you to do is it allows you to run the equivalent of SQL operations on database and non-database objects. The syntax is a little different. Notice the select is at the end. It starts with from. All right. Microsoft came up with this. This is their own stuff. All right. So as mentioned, the approach in this chapter uses the tooling of Visual Studio and gets you up and running quickly. There isn't anything wrong with the code. Some people think it's too simplistic and they would rather do it themselves. So as mentioned previously, you can. All right. So the author tells you, again, I'm not going to do this, but the author tells you here to come in here, right-click on the controllers folder, choose Add Controller, and this time choose the Add Scaffold dialog box. All right, so we want MVC5 controller with views using Entity Framework. In the box, change the controller name to something appropriate, like Store Manager Controller. Select Album as the model class type. They talk in here on page 86 about what's changed. I'm not going to read that because if you haven't used a prior version of this, it doesn't really matter, to be honest with you, what's changed. All right. So they show you what it should look like here on the bottom of page 86. And the author says, then click the New Data Context button that you see right here to launch the New Data Context dialog that's shown in the next figure. First thing you're asked to do here is to rename it, and they rename it Music Store DB, and click the Add button. Because the Add Controller dialog button contains the required information, it's now enabled. It says verify that the dialog that you're working on matches the one that's shown here. And then they say after you click the Add button, Scaffolding jumps into action. It adds a bunch of new files for you, and it puts them in the right location. So the data context, as it says here, starting on the bottom of page 87, the scaffolding adds a music store db.cs file into the models folder of your project. Well, let's go back and take a look at that. Alright, so we're in the models folder, and we want the music store db.cs. There it is. So you can see what's in here. That's the stuff that's been added. The class inside the file derives from the Entity Frameworks DB context class and gives you access to these 3 different classes. Even though you told scaffolding only about album, it saw the related models, those being genre and artists, and added them as well, as you can see. So the code is shown here, and the same code is shown on the top of page 88 in the book. Alright, and on page 88, the author mentions here a quick introduction to Entity Framework data migrations. It says the long comment at the top, the thing that you see up here, explains 2 things. It says you own this code now, so anything you change, you're responsible for. Alright, and you own responsibility for the code. So if the model changes, you better change this code also to reflect that. Simply, that's what they're saying. Scaffolding template you selected also generates a store manager controller in the controllers folder of the application. There it is right there. It says here the controller has all the code required to select and edit album information. Right now, I guess they talk more about it later on in the chapter. So let's just jump back into the book. I'm up to page 90. Scaffolding also generates actions to create, edit, and delete and show detailed album information, which we look at later. The views, as they say, after scaffolding finishes running, you'll also find a collection of views under the Views Store Manager folder. That's the one that was just created, and you'll notice there's the views. These views provide the user interface for listing, editing, and deleting albums. Alright, you can see the list here, and you can see the list in your book on the bottom of page 90. The index view, as mentioned on the top of page 91, has all the code you need to display a table full of music albums. Alright? The model for the view is an enumerable sequence, and you know what enumerations are, of album objects. The view takes the model and uses a for each loop to create an HTML table with information about each album. And that's what they're showing you right there. There's setting it up. Okay? So there's your headings, and there's your actual information. And again, what you see here is the same stuff that we should see underneath index.cshtml. And there it is. Alright, as mentioned, each table row includes links to edit, delete, and detail update an album. Again, as mentioned earlier, the scaffolded code is a starting point. You probably want to add your own code. For example, if there are things that you want to put in there that are going to do validation, most of them are not provided for you, so you'd have to put that kind of thing in. It says before you start the application running, let's address the question from earlier in the chapter. What database does Music Store DB use? You haven't created a database or even specified a database connection. The code first approach of the Entity Framework attempts to use convention over configuration as much as possible. If you don't configure specific mappings, the Entity Framework uses conventions to create a database schema for you. If you don't configure a specific database connection, it creates one using a convention. So it does it the way that it's shown here, down towards the middle half of page 92. Without a specific connection configured, as mentioned on the bottom of 92 and going on to 93, the Entity Framework tries to connect a local DB instance of an SQL server and find a database with a name such as DB context, with the same name as the DB context derived class. If the Entity Framework can't connect, but to the server but doesn't find a database, it creates one. If you run an application after scaffolding completes and you navigate to the store manager URL, you'll discover that the Entity Framework has created a database named mymusicstore.models.musicstoredb in local DB. And as they mentioned there, if you look, that's what it's created for you. And that's good, because that's what we created in the album class. That's what we created in the artist class. That's what we created in the genre class. And when we came in and started working with the Entity Framework, that's what we had. All right. Now, as mentioned about halfway down on page 94, an easy way to keep a database in sync is to allow the Entity Framework to recreate an existing database. You can tell the Entity Framework, as mentioned here, to recreate a database every time the app starts, or you can tell it to recreate it only when it detects a change in the model. You can choose one of these strategies when calling the setInitializer method. When you call it, as mentioned, you need to pass in an iDatabaseInitializer object. Two are provided: drop create database always, or drop create database if model changes. So the always means recreate it every time the model changes. As mentioned, there is if you only change it. I'm on page 95 here. For the MVC Music Store, pretend you want to start development by recreating the database every time the app starts. However, you want the database to have a couple of genres, artists, and even an album so you can work with it. In this case, it says you can derive a class from the drop create database class and override the seed method. So in other words, we want to make sure that even when we recreate the database, we've got some sample data in it. And that's the stuff that's shown here halfway down on page 95. Bottom third of page 95, I guess. So when you create it and you bring it up, you'll have this. Not a lot to it, but at least there's something there. All right. So they mentioned voila on the bottom of page 96. You have a real running app with real functionality and real data. All right. The author says, although it might seem like a lot of work, you spent most of the chapter so far going over the generated code in the Entity Framework. It says after you know what scaffolding can do for you, the amount of work is relatively small and only requires these three steps. Implement the model class, scaffold the controller and views, and choose the database initialization strategy. So, let's talk about CRUD. Editing an album. One of the scenarios, as it says there, that scaffolding handles is the edit scenario for an album. The scenario begins when the user clicks the edit link that we saw previously. So when the author is in an album here and clicks edit, what do you want to do? As it says, it sends the HTTP GET request to the web server. It says you can think of this as request, get me an album. For here they put in 5, so edit album number 5. And we'd have to know, I guess, what the particular, if we're going to do it that way, what the number is. So the default MVC routing rules deliver the GET for the store manager to the edit action. It says you don't need to type this in because it was generated for you automatically. So what they're saying right here is if what you put in was a number that doesn't exist, let's say you left it blank, or let's say we had 5 albums, 1 through 5, and you put in a 0 or you put in a 6 or whatever. So if it's null, return that it was a bad request. Okay. Then we're trying to find the particular album. Again, if it's not found, same kind of thing. Otherwise, give us the information. So this information that you see right here, that information, Rush, Rock, Caravan 999, supposing that that is the album with ID 5, is going to produce this. So we can go in there, as shown on page 98, and make any changes that we need to make. When users edit an album, as mentioned on the bottom of the page, you don't want them to enter freeform text for genre and artist. Instead, these are made as drop-downs, so you want to make it harder for them to screw up. All right. Now this is edit, remember. Okay. So it says the scaffolding is smart enough to realize this too, because it understands the association between album, artist, and genre. Instead of giving a text box, it generates an edit view with a drop-down list. All right, which we've already mentioned. The code shown on the bottom of page 99 is from the store manager's edit view, and it's the code that builds the drop-down list for the genre. Okay. and it's discussed more in the following chapter. All right, turning up to page 100 here. Under Models and View Models Redo, it says, remember when the preceding chapter talked about the concept of a view-specific model? The album edit scenario is a good example where your model object doesn't quite contain all the information. You need a list of all possible genres and artists. Two different things exist, or two different possibilities exist to do this. It says the scaffolding generated code demonstrates the first option, pass the information along with the view bag structure, which is reasonable and easy to implement. All right, but again, it says some might want it strongly typed, which means you won't have the IntelliSense. The strongly typed will probably look at the second option, build a view-specific model to carry the information in. A little bit more work, but a little more power that it gives you. And they show you this again on the bottom of page 100 and the top of page 101. Again, it's not my intention here. I would be stupid to think I can, go over this stuff this quickly, but it's just being introduced. So you've heard about it. So if any of you do go out after you graduate in May and possibly go and try to get a job in this field, you'll at least have heard of this stuff. Okay. The action accepting the post request to edit the album also has the name edit, but it's differentiated because it's got a post action as opposed to a get action. All right. Now they talk about something here on page 102 called the happy path. It says the happy path is the code you execute when the model is in a valid state. You can save the object into the database. Well, not only is there a happy path, there's a sad path. It says it's the path the action takes when the model is invalid. All right. So in other words, you try to put something in here that's wrong. So notice they're given a good example here on page 103. You put in a non-numeric value for the price. So it has to basically not write it to the database, and it has to let the user know. And that's what they're showing you on the bottom of page, or I guess the top half of page 103. All right. It says model binding here on the bottom of the page. The author says, imagine you implemented the edit section of an HTTP post and you didn't know anything about the MVC features that can make your life easier. Because you're a professional developer, you realize that the edit view is going to post form values to the server. If you want to retrieve these, you might choose to pull the values directly from the request, as shown here. It says, as you can imagine, this becomes tedious, and that's why a lot of this stuff has been written for you. All right. The default model binder, it says, instead of digging form values out of the request, the edit action simply takes an album object out as a parameter and allows you to work with the individual components. Bottom of page 105, as we're just about finished here. Explicit model binding. Model binding implicitly, it says, goes to work when you have an action parameter. You can also explicitly invoke model binding using the update model and try update model methods in your controller. Update model throws an exception if something goes wrong during model binding and the model is invalid. And they give you an example on the bottom of page 105 and going on to page 106 of what this might look like. All right, and that's pretty much it. The only thing I would add, in the summary section on the bottom of page 107 and the top part of page 108. In this chapter, you saw how to build an MVC application by focusing on model objects. You can write the definitions for your models using C# code and then scaffold out the parts of the app based on a specific model type. Out of the box, all scaffolding works with the EF or entity framework, but scaffolding itself, as mentioned on the next page, is extensible and customizable. So you can have it do some of the work for you, or all of the work for you, or whatever. We also looked a little bit at model binding. At this point, the author says you've only scratched the surface of how model objects drive an application. In the coming chapters, they'll go over the rest. So remember, what's left in this chapter here, I've only gone over chapter 1, getting started, chapter 2, view controllers, chapter 3, views, and chapter 4, models. Just out of time. Chapter 5 goes into HTML5 helpers. When you write MVC code directly like this, you don't use server controls. Instead, you use what are called HTML helpers. If you're interested in that, go take a read. Chapter 6, data annotations and more on validation. Chapter 7 is on authorization. Chapter 8 gets into AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript and XML. 9 is more on controller routing. 10 gets into the role that NuGet plays in this, and it's a lot more than just providing the jQuery that we've talked about. 11 goes into Web API. I like to read that one myself because I know very little about Web API. 12 goes into how to build a single page app using a kind of JavaScript called AngularJS. 13 goes more into security and talks about dependency injection. 14, they mentioned earlier to you that they wanted you to click the unit testing box, and if you do, chapter 14 talks more about that. 15 talks about how you can extend model view controller more than we have. 16 is on advanced topics, and 17 is a real world example. All right, so that's all that I've got for you.